Hello, my name is Dr. Esmacher, and welcome to our discussion on McCarthyism and domestic containment during the early Cold War. Imagine for a moment that you live in a society where everything you say or do could be regarded as suspicious or held against you. If you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, or even know somebody who is under a cloud of suspicion, you yourself become a suspect in this society. This is the reality of the 1950s in the United States. People were so terribly afraid of communists outside that they were also paranoid about the potential of communists inside the United States, that their friends, their neighbors, even their own family members could potentially be secret communists. So today we're going to talk about why the paranoia over communism in the United States. We're going to talk about Senator Joseph McCarthy, who the phenomena of McCarthyism is named after, and talk a little bit about the extent of anti-communism in the United States. In 1950, the United States Armed Forces produced a public service announcement called How to Spot a Communist. This very short public service announcement, which was designed to play as a newsreel before films, gave very general overview of a person that could be considered suspicious, that could be potentially a communist. Among the traits that they identified in this public service announcement were anyone who read anything from communist or communist-leaning organizations, such as labor union newspapers, anyone who openly agreed with communist policies, even if they were policies that were not only supported by communists, but by other groups, such as, for example, support for the process of decolonization or colonial independence movements, and someone who openly criticized the United States government and foreign policy. If this sounds overly broad to you, it was. And that's one of the reasons that Americans lived in paranoia of being labeled a communist. If you did anything remotely left leaning in terms of politics, then you could be considered to be at least a communist sympathizer, if not an active communist yourself. So, because of the very vague definitions being floated around of what could be considered communist in the United States, many people found themselves having to defend themselves and their loved ones, their coworkers, against allegations that they were communist. To understand why the allegation someone was communist was such a powerful accusation in the early Cold War, we have to talk a little bit about how the Cold War changes the government, changes the day-to-day reality in the United States. During the Cold War, the federal government grows in strength and size. We had already seen a tremendous growth in the size and strength of the federal government as a result of the total war concept within the World War II, where all resources in the United States were devoted to winning the war. Now, a lot of this big government buildup, which had happened during World War II, continued because of the Cold War. We also have a burgeoning military industrial complex, again coming out of World War II, this relationship between the military advancing cutting edge technology and then contracting with private industry to produce on the mass scale these new inventions will continue throughout the Cold War and will grow again in scale and sometimes in secrecy. The government will also push for funding scientific research, and universities were actually a key tool in this process to fund research. The idea of the Cold War was to constantly compete against the Soviet Union and end up with the upper hand. So STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, gains a huge official support from the government in terms of grants to research universities to pursue projects that were tangential to the military-industrial complex during the Cold War, and also the encouragement of scholarships for students studying STEM so that they could go on after they had gotten their degrees and work in government programs and defense. There are also potential changes in immigration, at least being discussed during this time period in the Cold War, because the immigration laws are still very much tied to the changes that had been made in 1924 with the Johnson-Reed Act, which had set for the first time quotas in immigration in the United States. There was some concern, however, that this quota system would fail to respond effectively to immigrants who were claiming to come over as refugees from communism. So, should we adjust our immigration policies to be able to take in more refugees from the expansion of communism in places like the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, and as we'll see eventually, Vietnam? Now, the Cold War doesn't just beef up the United States government and increase the government's interest in research and technology and STEM, it also promotes American culture abroad. One of the things that is interesting about the Cold War is because it is not a direct military engagement, it is very much a war for the hearts and the minds of people across the world. And so, one of the ways that the United States sought to show up their particular side of the Cold War was through culture and propaganda. So the government actually commissioned Hollywood to produce propaganda films, much like they had during World War II, which we discussed in an earlier session about animation being used, Walt Disney, Bugs Bunny, fighting the Japanese and the Nazis. Now we have Hollywood talking about the evils of communism. And one of the classics of these early Cold War propaganda films, The Red Menace, produced in 1949, shows how ordinary Americans could be sucked in to this communist vortex, with the main character being lured into joining a local communist party because of a woman. So it's an interesting film. I recommend checking it out. One of the other things that the government did in terms of propaganda was not just overt propaganda, commissioning Hollywood to produce anti-communist films, or the burgeoning TV industry, which we'll talk about in another episode, to produce specific episodes touting various government programs and again stressing anti-communism. But we also see the CIA get involved in promoting American culture abroad. Yes, the Central Intelligence Agency, which is a brand new agency created in the aftermath of World War II, is getting involved in promoting American culture overseas. Particularly, they're going to promote artists like Jackson Pollock and Grandma Moses, and they're also going to stage goodwill sports tours, like tennis star Althea Gibson was sent to Asia to play various tennis matches. And this was particularly significant because Althea Gibson was one of the first African American female tennis players to really make it big on the pro circuit. So, why is the CIA sending an African American tennis player on a tour overseas, particularly in places in Asia? And why are they promoting artists like Jackson Pollock, whose work in the modern art movement was very controversial? In fact, many people call his art style splatter paintings. They argue that toddlers can do similar sorts of art. And then Grandma Moses was also a little bit unconventional as an artist. She had started painting once she had become a grandmother. So this was a very late in life hobby. She produced folk art. So again, not something the traditional art establishment really saw as polished or traditional. So why is the CIA going against the grain in terms of what even Americans are pursuing at home? Because neither Grandma Moses nor Jackson Pollock, in terms of art, were really big on the art scene during their lifetime. And then Althea Gibson, again, is a female African American athlete at a time where most of the southern United States is still segregated. So the CIA is promoting these rather unconventional Americans as a way to stress just how free the United States is. That even though many in the art world criticized people like Jackson Pollock, who would not be fully appreciated until after his death in 1956, he was still allowed to make his art. So the United States is making a point that we don't censor ideas, even if we think that they're not that great or they're unpopular. We don't agree with censorship. Okay, people have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion in the United States. And by promoting unconventional folks in the arts, in sports, and culture across the world, the CIA sought to highlight the diversity of the American experience.